In March 2022, the fashion world was rocked when Inditex, the giant behind Zara, Bershka, and Pull&Bear, suddenly shut off all 502 of its Russian stores. The world applauded this principled stand, but what if I told you that barely a year later, Russian customers were shopping in stores called Maag and Ecru that looked suspiciously like their favorite Zara outlets? Today, we're uncovering how Inditex managed to keep its billion-euro Russian revenue stream flowing while technically complying with sanctions. It's a story involving mysterious UAE companies, elaborate rebranding schemes, and a business strategy so audacious it blurs the line between genius and scandal. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the corporate exodus began almost immediately. Companies scrambled to distance themselves from Moscow faster than you could say reputational damage. Inditex joined this exodus in March 2022, announcing with great fanfare that it was suspending operations across all 502 Russian stores and halting online sales. The move was applauded across European capitals and seen as a principled stand against aggression. But, interestingly, while other companies were burning bridges and walking away with billions in losses, Inditex crafted what can only be described as the most elaborate see-you-later in corporate history. Instead of liquidating assets or simply abandoning the market, they orchestrated a sale of Daher Group, a UAE-based multinational with expertise in logistics and supply chain management. Now, Daher Group wasn't some fly-by-night operation. This is a serious player in the Middle Eastern business landscape, with operations spanning aviation, industrial services, and retail logistics across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. They knew exactly what they were buying and, more importantly, how to make it work within the complex web of international sanctions. The sale agreement, finalized in October 2022 and approved by Russian authorities in March 2023, included a clause that should have raised more eyebrows than it did. Inditex and Daher included an option for potential future collaboration through a franchise agreement in the Russian market if circumstances changed. In other words, this wasn't goodbye, it was see you when the heat dies down. The financial terms, mysteriously undisclosed. For a market that generated over €1 billion annually for Inditex, making Russia their second largest market after Spain, the silence around the deal's value speaks volumes. I mean, you don't typically keep quiet about good news in business, which suggests this arrangement was designed more for flexibility than profit maximization. By April 2023, something remarkable happened. Clothing stores began reopening across Russia under new names: Maag, Ecru, and Villet. If you're thinking these names sound like a random word generator had a particularly uninspired day, you wouldn't be wrong. But the bland naming was just the beginning of this corporate magic trick. Former Zara stores became Maag, Pull&Bear transformed into Bershka was reborn as Ecru, and Stradivarius reappeared as Villet. The timing was precise. Stores reopened in the exact same locations, often in prime real estate spots in Moscow's most prestigious shopping centers. Banners supporting the new brand name Maag adorned storefronts in major shopping malls, but everything else remained suspiciously familiar. Customers walking into these new stores experienced what can only be described as fashion déjà vu. The store layouts mirrored their Inditex predecessors with uncanny precision. The product placement, the interior design philosophy, even the way clothes were organized on the racks, it all felt like stepping into a parallel universe where Zara had simply changed its name after a particularly dramatic rebranding meeting. But the real genius was in the supply chain architecture. Inditex continued developing technical files and design specifications for clothing collections in Spain. These files were then sent to Daher Group in the UAE, where they were rebranded under the new store names. The clothes were produced, often in the same factories that had previously manufactured for Inditex, then shipped to Russia under new brand identities. This was fashion alchemy. The same design teams, the same fast fashion philosophy, the same trend-chasing approach, all wrapped in new packaging that technically complied with sanctions while maintaining the essence of what made Inditex successful in Russia. To understand how this operation worked, we need to appreciate the strategic brilliance of choosing Daher Group as an intermediary. Based in the UAE, Daher operates in what can generously be called a sanctions-flexible environment. The UAE has maintained a notably neutral stance on Russia-related sanctions, making it an ideal base for companies seeking to maintain business relationships that might be complicated elsewhere. Daher's expertise in logistics and supply chain management made them uniquely qualified to handle this complex operation. They weren't just buying retail stores, they were acquiring an entire ecosystem of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and retail expertise. Their experience in managing multi-regional operations across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East provided the perfect cover for maintaining connections between Spanish design teams and Russian consumers. The company's structure also provided legal insulation. As a UAE-based entity, Daher could maintain relationships with Russian retail operations while technically remaining independent from direct European sanctions. This jurisdictional arbitrage, essentially playing different legal systems against each other, is a sophisticated strategy that requires deep understanding of international law and trade regulations. What's particularly clever is how Daher positioned itself not as a proxy for Inditex, but as a legitimate business acquiring distressed assets and creating new brands. From a legal standpoint, they were simply a Middle Eastern company that happened to open fashion stores in Russia using designs that happened to resemble popular Spanish brands. The resemblance, they could argue, was purely coincidental or perhaps a tribute to successful fashion concepts. Let's talk numbers, because in business, everything ultimately comes down to the bottom line. Russia represented massive revenue for Inditex, over €1 billion annually from a market where they operated 502 stores. You cannot walk away from that kind of revenue stream. It's potentially devastating to shareholder value. The fast fashion industry operates on razor-thin margins compensated by enormous volume. Losing a market the size of Russia doesn't just mean losing current revenue, it means losing future growth potential, market share, and the economies of scale that make the entire business model work. For Inditex, maintaining some connection to this market wasn't just smart business, it was potentially essential for long-term viability. But of course, ethics get murky. While Inditex could claim technical compliance with sanctions, they did sell their Russian operations and officially exited the market. The rebranded stores suggest a level of ongoing involvement that raises questions about the spirit versus the letter of international restrictions. The performance of these rebranded stores tell its own story. Despite opening in prime locations with familiar products, the stores face challenges, with reports suggesting disappointing performance compared to their Inditex predecessors. This suggests that brand identity and consumer trust aren't easily transferable, even when everything else remains essentially the same. This brings us to the central question. Is what Inditex and Daher did legal? The short answer is probably yes. They appeared to comply with the technical requirements of international sanctions while maintaining business relationships through third-party arrangements. It's a masterclass in legal engineering, finding ways to achieve desired outcomes while staying within the technical boundaries of regulations. But legality and ethics aren't always the same thing. The purpose of sanctions isn't just to create paperwork obstacles, it's to actually isolate target economies and reduce their access to Western goods and services. When companies find ways to maintain essentially the same business relationships under different names, they're arguably undermining the intended impact of those sanctions. The rebranded stores represent a broader challenge in our globalized economy. When international law tries to segment interconnected markets, businesses inevitably find creative ways to maintain profitable relationships. The question becomes whether these workarounds serve legitimate business interests or undermine international cooperation on important geopolitical issues. What's particularly striking is how the arrangement benefits everyone involved except the sanctions regime itself. Inditex maintains connection to a profitable market, Daher Group acquires a lucrative business opportunity, Russian consumers continue accessing familiar products, and everyone can claim technical compliance with international restrictions. The Inditex-Daher arrangement isn't happening in isolation. It represents a broader trend of companies finding creative solutions to maintain business relationships despite geopolitical tensions, from energy companies using complex trading agreements to technology firms licensing intellectual property through third parties. This global economy is developing increasingly sophisticated methods for working around political barriers. This has serious implications for how we think about economic sanctions as foreign policy tools. If major companies can maintain essentially the same business relationships under different structures, what's the actual impact of these restrictions? Are sanctions becoming elaborate theater that creates compliance costs without achieving policy objectives? The fashion industry in particular seems well suited to these kinds of arrangements. Unlike technology or energy sectors, where products are clearly identifiable and traceable, fashion operates on trends. designs, and brand concepts that can be easily repackaged and redistributed. A dress is a dress, regardless of whether it's sold under the Zara or Maag label. Russian shoppers buying from Maag might not realize they're essentially purchasing Zara designs through a complex corporate structure. Similarly, European consumers supporting Inditex might not understand that their purchases potentially support operations that maintain connections to sanctioned markets. The Inditex Daher saga illustrates something fundamental about modern business. In a globally interconnected economy, clean breaks are nearly impossible. When companies have spent decades building supply chains, market relationships, and brand recognition across multiple countries, political boundaries become obstacles to navigate rather than barriers to respect. This doesn't necessarily make what Inditex did right or wrong, it makes it inevitable. As long as there are profits to be made and legal structures to exploit, companies will find ways to maintain business relationships despite political tensions. The question isn't whether this will happen, but how societies will choose to respond. Looking forward, this case study suggests that future sanctioned regimes need to be more sophisticated about addressing third-party arrangements and complex corporate structures. Simple restrictions on direct business relationships aren't sufficient when companies can maintain essentially the same operations through intermediaries and rebranding. For Inditex, the strategy appears to be working. They've maintained connection to a valuable market while technically complying with international restrictions. Whether this represents brilliant business strategy or sanctions evasions depends largely on your perspective and priorities. What's undeniable is that this arrangement represents the future of international commerce in an era of increasing geopolitical tensions. As countries use economic tools to pursue political objectives, businesses will become increasingly creative about maintaining profitable relationships across political boundaries. What do you think? Is this a savvy business move or a betrayal of global sanctions? Share your thoughts below. If you're fascinated by the hidden truths of the fashion industry, check out our deep dive into Shein. Discover how the Chinese giant is reshaping global fashion at a controversial cost. Click here to watch now.